the architecture. What are the functions that have to be performed so that the goals can be met in the health system? I mean, when you think of the functions, what is the first thing that you always, I mean, that most of us and most people, both experts and non-experts, would think about? You know, what's the key function of the health system? Nora?
The service delivery.
The delivery, the actual provision of services, right? I mean, you're thinking that if I break my leg, I want to have someone that can actually fix it, right? If I have a young child, I want to bring her to a health clinic and have her immunized. And a pregnant woman wants her pregnancy to be, it's the actual provision of services, okay? And that is indeed, you know, just like we can think of a defining goal to improve health, the actual provision of services is the ultimate place where those two groups of people, population with needs and a set of providers who have been educated, hopefully technically, but also in ethical frameworks, to provide those services, they meet. They meet when that happens. These can be personal services, services that are consumed by the individual, like a vaccine or a diagnosis or a treatment, or they can be non-personal services. But even those have to be delivered. You know, if it's environmental sanitation, that's a service that gets delivered when you clean up the environment, or health education, mass health education. That's a service that gets delivered, okay? That's the core function of the health system. The notion here is that for that function to happen, there are at least three other enabling functions, okay, that will allow that defining function, that ultimate function of the system to happen. And they are enablers of that. So we're just going to very briefly mention them. Again, you will have whole courses on them. First function is stewardship. Let me show all of them. Second is financing, obviously. You can't have the delivery if there's no money in the system. Then you have the provision, which is the core function. And then the resource generation or development, like Jeremy was suggesting, okay? So let's just go quickly through some of these. So let's start here with stewardship. This is like the function of functions. Stewardship is about setting rules of the game, including how you will perform the other functions. This is a meta function. It's a function about the other functions. So what does this stewardship include? It includes a number of sub-functions. The first one is system design, right? That's where it becomes a meta function. So, you know, when you say, here's how the financing is going to work, how the provision of services, how the resources are going to be developed, that's a big part. Very important is priority setting. And you will have full courses about just this question. We have a center here for health decision science that just studies this question. How do we make decisions about what's important and what's not? And then there's this very important function that or sub-function that we've been talking about. Intersectoral advocacy. And because we know that there are all these other social determinants, a key function of the health system is not to perform those other functions of other systems, but to advocate for health as an objective. So this is the idea that health is not just a social system, the health system, it is an objective that other systems may also legitimately pursue, okay? So although improving health is not the defining goal of the education system, it is legitimate to argue that the education system, there should be a strong health education system, not just for its defining intrinsic goal of improving education, but also because it improves health. And vice versa, by the way. We very often justify investments in health because in addition to its role in improving health, it is instrumental in achieving other socially desirable goals, like improving education, because that relationship goes both ways, right? If you improve health, actually educational outcomes improve. kids that are born and in a when the delivery happens in a competent way or is handled in a competent fashion, that are well nourished, etc., learn better. Teachers who are healthy are better teachers. The number one cause of school absenteeism in Africa has been that teachers die from AIDS. So we want AIDS treatment as our intrinsic goal of improving health, but it's great that it also contributes to other socially valued goals like better education, because now you have teachers that can actually teach because they didn't die of AIDS. So intersectoral advocacy, which in this case is mobilizing other tools of public policy to pursue our defining goal of health, is a key part of stewardship. So that Ministry of Health who goes and persuades the Ministry of Finance to increase taxes on tobacco, she's doing that not because the Ministry of Health is in charge of taxation, but because that's an effective intervention for health. It's an effective health action. So it is part of her role to do this as part of stewardship, to generate this intersectoral. And then finally, the bulk of this function of stewardship, we're here in stewardship, these are the sub-functions of stewardship, is regulation. And this is the term you will more often hear. And in fact, you had it in multiple parts here, okay? Regulation is very important, okay? Setting rules of the game, a fair playing field. Remember that a pervasive characteristic of health services is asymmetry of information. Usually in that relationship, the providers, the health personnel as we call them, have much more information than the population at large, right? This is why we go to the doctor or the nurse, right? I don't know if this pain I have is something trivial or is something very serious that I'm going to die for. So a lot of what happens in the dynamics of health system is that there's huge information asymmetry. And therefore, a big part of what the collective mediator does is set rules. So, what do you need to present yourself as a doctor or a nurse? What are the credentials? Not anyone can just open a place and start giving medical advice, right? What drugs can you sell? What are the requirements for safety and efficacy? That's why we have the FDA. What requirements do you need to build a hospital or to build an X-ray machine, etc. Huge part of the health system. But it's only one very important part of stewardship. So for all of you who wrote regulation, very important, but it is a sub-function. And then the last sub-function, yes.
Regulations include the laws, the overall health laws?
Right. All the rules of the game. So general laws that, the limit what can be done and what cannot be. A lot of the restrictions we place on to promote responsiveness, things that you cannot do to patients, are part of that set of rules of the game. And then the final, very important, is performance assessment. And next session we will talk about this concept of performance. But a big instrument for stewardship is to be able to tell the other elements of the health system how well they're doing. And then if that leads to some decisions on regulation, for example, you lose your accreditation if you don't do well, then it becomes a very powerful element. So this is the function of functions. It regulates how everything else in the system happens. And it's a very important, misunderstood, and very often underemphasized function of the health system, okay? So that's first function. Second, we talk about financing. And here, let me go back here. As you can see, financing has three sub-functions. Again, I'm just going to mention them because you will have whole courses on this. Just think about that, The first one is revenue collection. How do you collect revenue? Either you have a system that collects taxes, or you have premiums that you need to collect, or you charge people for their out-of-pocket. Then this is not fun, I'm sorry, this should be say pooling. So then you pool those revenues into funds, and that's very important with insurance schemes, where you can actually neutralize. So it is fund, but it's fund pooling of those funds. And then the final one is you decide with those funds that you have pulled from multiple people what exactly you're going to purchase, what services. And you can, purchasing is a broad term. When you budget for certain services to be provided, that's a form of purchasing, right? Except you're budgeting the inputs. But you will have plenty of opportunities. So purchasing or budgeting is the third part of funding that. And then finally, of course, we have the provision. I already made the distinction. This is a very classical distinction, and a lot of discussion on what are the boundaries, but the set of services is the defining function. And of course, the resource generation includes human resources, technological resources like drugs and equipment, information resources, knowledge. So research generates that big resource called health. And what I'd like to finish with is just by telling you that historically, systems vary in the extent to which the public sector or the private sector carry out some of these functions, okay? And this question of the public-private mix is one of the most pervasive issues of debate when it comes to health policy. And when we talk about health reform, 2 sessions from now, this will be a key part of our discussion, okay? And also when we talk about health systems dynamic, historically, the way this mix is accomplished has varied, Today you would say most people would agree that stewardship is like the quintessential public function, okay? In most advanced countries and most reform efforts go to trying to make financing mostly a public function. When you come to provision, actually most health systems have pretty pluralistic, where you have a lot of private providers. Some are for-profit, some are not for-profit, some may be faith-based, community-based organizations. And when it comes to resource generation, you have a huge element of a private sector, particularly when it comes to drugs, technologies, equipment, construction, etc. So but this has not been like this all the time in history, and it's not uniform across countries. So this question of the mix is very important. And one of the big conceptual frameworks is to start thinking about health systems in terms of functions. Very often we talk about health systems in terms of inputs. So we talk about the doctors and the hospitals and the drugs, the input side. We look at the institutions, how they're configured, who's the ministry, what other institutions there are. Sometimes we talk about population groups. There's a piece for the employees, there's a piece for the poor. Those are necessary ingredients, but thinking about the health system in terms of the functions is, I think, a better way.